need to be in contact with the whole system. So would some of you trade places? If you're with all the people you were with yesterday, would some of you be willing to pack up your stuff again and move around? Please? Please, please? We want you to hear some other voices today. Thank you so much. I know. They're also still trickling in. They're also still trickling in. So if you're coming in, maybe you'd be willing to sit in a different spot today, find a different group of people to share with. So here's a little secret. One of the ways we practice big change is by being willing to do little change. Just file that away. Yeah, can you pull up that prayer, that email? Available. Okay. We can just do it later. We can just do it later.
Do you remember what you sent it to?
Your At Leader's Journey.
One more time. Share a note with you, information, product basis.
That's not it.
Drafted outline.
You know what? It might be at the end of. No, it was a fresh note. It was a fresh one. It's okay. We can do it later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No problem.
You're going to lead them in prayer?
Yeah. Why don't you, since I did it last night?
I'm going to ask them.
Okay. Okay. Here we go. And for those of you who maybe weren't here last night, everybody gets to go home early today. So just want to remind you of that. So hang on. We may go a little fast, but we're going to be done at least no later than 1 o'clock. So who was here last night? Okay. So pretty much most of the room. That's great. And if you weren't, we're just going to assume that there's one person at every table that maybe wasn't here last night. So would you just take 2 minutes and bring that imaginary person up to speed? Let them know, what did we do last night? What stayed with you? What do you remember? Ready, set, go. Maybe it was from my counseling address. I don't think it was, but it might have been. I was on my iPad. So, mhm. Well, I have it on mine. I can bring it up. It happens to me all the time now that I can't find stuff.
See, I just type in Trisha and it comes up. There it is.
Huh. Okay.
It's just crazy.
Even though there's my whole name right there.
And it's from your Trisha Taylor at leadersjourney.com.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it.
Like 10 conversations with people who said it went really well, and I've actually said, so what was your takeaway? And they got it.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
got what he
yeah,
was saying.
yeah.
His name, he's the music worship leader.
Take one more minute.
One more minute, I can get it going.
Okay.
And then I heard the past is always present.
After all of that, I decided I want to do this last.
Well, now we have it.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about how they're feeling and how
Oh,
they're praying?
yes.
Something for your announcement.
Okay.
Somebody must have lost that.
Thank you.
All right, would you
Hey,
come?
everybody. You can come back here and let us stop and make a quick announcement. All the ladies need to check both earlobes. Somebody,
Sit down, Stephen.
somebody's missing a really pretty silver hoop earring. It's a hoop, yes. Uh-huh. Yay, we found its home. There, there you go.
Okay, we're going to pray together in just a minute, and we're going to pray around our tables, but I want to do something with you to prepare you for the prayer exercise. Here are the options. The options are mad, sad, glad, or scared. If you're from South Georgia, you can make that rhyme. Mad, sad, glad, and scad. All right, those are the options. Remember those. What I want to ask you is to have a conversation around your table about this. How are you feeling, using one of those options, about being alive in an era where churches are having to learn fundamentally new ways of leading the congregation to the future? How are you feeling about coming to a workshop on Friday night and Saturday where the message is you've got to learn a new way of moving forward? How are you feeling about that? Mad, sad, glad, scared? You can feel more than one thing at a time. But around your table, just talk about how you're feeling about being in this process.
I do the rubber band first and talk about potential energy and the energy for change. And then I say, this is what it might look like.
Would you start with the rubber band thing?
After they pray? Okay. Oh, yeah, we correspond. Yeah. Uh-huh. Maybe. I knew it last night. They both are. They both are. Uh-huh. He never responded one way or the other. Probably not much. I think it would be okay to move on if you want to.
So would you come back here? Thanks for doing that. Finish those conversations up. Come back here and let me give you your next set of instructions. You ever had the experience of knowing the right thing to do, but the stirred up feelings that you had kept you from doing the right thing? I have that experience. No? Never had that experience? All the time? What I want you to do is to just spend a few minutes, ask one person at your table to lead in prayer, and ask the Lord to help us be really present to those feelings, not to repress them or deny them or judge them or shame ourselves for having them, but somehow in the midst of the sadness and the joy and the fear and the anger, to be able to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit as the Spirit speaks to us. Would you get one person at your table to just lead in a prayer that prays something like that, and anything else you want to pray for the day, and then we're going to get into our training. Okay? Go.
think you're the person to do that. This table right here. And this table right here.
Lord, thank you for gathering us together today. We would simply say, come, Holy Spirit, and be among us. Help us to listen to each other with one ear, to your Spirit with the other. You be our teacher and our guide. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.
So sometimes it helps us to engage a new concept if we play with it a little bit first. So all of you have on your table some rubber bands. Everybody can get one. No shooting your rubber band, right? Just hang on to it. One of the things that is tricky about change in a group of people is, where does the energy for change come from? How do we harness some kind of momentum, some kind of energy for change when, as we talked about last night, systems are always resisting change, right? And so here's a fun way to think about it. If you stretch a rubber band, everybody can stretch your rubber band if you want to. If you stretch a rubber band and you hold it like this, you create tension. Okay? I was talking about this one time, this has been years and years ago, and a young woman came up to me afterward, and I was saying, this is the kind of tension that we need to help us with change. And she came up and she said, I'm a middle school science teacher. And you were talking about how that tension gives us energy for change. And she said, I want to tell you what that kind of energy is called. The energy in a stretched rubber band is called potential energy. I just thought that was so great because what we're thinking about is what is our potential for the future? And we're talking about how do we get the energy in the process in order to fuel the change that we know that we need. And we're going to talk more about some of the basics of that in a minute. But one of the ways that we do that is that we're able to take one point and think about going to another point, and we feel the stretch. Y'all are feeling the stretch with the kinds of things that you're being asked to do to help Christ Memorial be as healthy as possible, positioned for that potential future. And then holding that so that there's energy in the space to fuel change. Now, right now, you can just play with your rubber band. We're going to come back and put some concepts around that idea, but the main thing I want you to remember right now is this kind of tension creates energy for change. Okay. Let's put some words around that.
So here's how the first part of the morning is going to go. We have a concept we want you to get, and so get in your active learner mode because we're going to present the concept, and then we're going to actually ask you to replicate it on a blank piece of paper, and you're going to get a grade. No, not really. You're not going to get a grade. But we're going to ask you to replicate it on a blank piece of paper, and then we're going to talk about the practical implications. So one of the things that is just true about human life, we don't have time, but we could start here with Roger, and we could go around the room. We're not going to do this. But what we could do is we could go around the room and ask you to tell us what is your kind of working understanding of how change takes place? If you were trying to lead change in your family or in your church or in your business or in the community group that you were a part of, you have an implicit or an implied way of thinking about that's conceptual, that you're not really mostly aware of. Mostly what you're aware of is what you do. But what you do grows out of how you think. And what we said to you last night, what we're saying to you again today is we've got to learn to think about how we lead change differently. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put the concept on the table, and then we're going to let you kind of internalize the concept. The information won't transform. But if you don't have the information, that you can't use it, right? And so we want you to get the information inside of you. Sometimes I'll say, I want to be able to call you at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, tell me about generating and sustaining creative tension. And you say, oh, that's this, this, and this. I want it to be internalized in that kind of way. But where we want to spend most of our time today, I'm not going to call you at 2 o'clock in the morning, Stephen. I promise I'm not. What we want to spend the better part of our day, or the early part of the morning, is thinking about the application of that. So then what does that mean that church leaders do, okay? So here's the way the model goes. The first piece of the model is that you've got to get a really clear sense of current reality. And how I want you to think about this, and of course we've done a lot of work around that, right? Tricia and I worked with the Discernment team here. We did 100+ interviews, or almost 100 interviews with people. We looked for common themes about feedback that we were getting. We shared those common themes in a report. We had a congregational meeting where we asked you whether what we were hearing was accurate or not, and you said to us almost universally that document around current reality was a really good snapshot in time of what was real. And what we attempted to do when we did that, and this is the word that I want you to hear, what we attempted to do when we were working on current reality is we attempted to create a narrative or a story, right? Again, we don't have time to do this, but we could start here with Caroline and go around the room and say, tell us the story of what's going on at Christ Memorial. and you have a story that you tell. Now, in a room with 100 people, plus 100 plus people, if you don't work at it, what you end up finding is variations on that theme. That's what we found in the current reality. What we looked for was, if we had heard wildly different stories, we would have said, we hadn't gotten to what's real yet. Well, you know, when one person says this and focuses on this piece of the nuance, and another person says focuses on this piece of the nuance, then you're in the same story. You're just looking at different parts of that. But the beginning place is that what you do is you work on getting a clear picture of current reality, and you write that, you get that in narrative form. The other thing I want to say about current reality is this is not a one-time, one-and-done deal. So you can't say, well, so Jim and Tricia helped us get that done, so that's done. The reason for that is that the pace of change is so rapid that both in the church and around the church and in the larger culture, the pace of change is so rapid that one of the leadership skills is the ongoing work of updating the current reality narrative. So that's part one. Could we get the slide up? I'm sorry. Yeah, so current reality, clear, shared, and compelling. And now go ahead to the second one. The second piece is a similar narrative. It's a narrative of God's emerging future. See the rubber band that Tricia has over her hand?
Current reality, God's emerging future.
Right. And so let's talk about the rubber band for just a minute. Well, let's talk about the emerging future, and I'll come back to that. So what you are currently involved in is the work of asking, what is the future that God is calling us to? And churches that do this work well come to some shared sense of that.
It doesn't mean everybody sees exactly the same thing.
Talk about that.
It doesn't mean that we all are focused on exactly the same expression, but we have some shared idea about the direction we're going and how we'll know when we get there.
And to get there requires a lot of dialogue, and this is the part you're not going to like. It requires that you do some dialogue that gets differing opinions on the table. Remember the imagery of the body last night? Do you think the hand experiences reality the way the foot does? Or that the ear experiences it the way the eye does? And often what happens is, so Tricia is the one who taught me this out of her counseling practice. She says, your brain is wired to see difference as threat. So I come in and say, I think God wants us to do this, is calling us here. And Tricia comes in and says, no, I think God is calling us here. And when that happens, a sense of threat emerges, and a part of what leaders have to learn to do is to keep those options alive rather than saying, okay, we'll do what you want to do. All right, no, you got to do what I want to do.
Yeah, because for me, a lot of times what I think when we say we need to be on the same page is I think we all need to be on my page. I mean, that's down deep, that's what I think, right? Unless I don't care that much, in which case I'll just abdicate responsibility and say, you do what you want. But what we're talking about here is more of a tension in a good way, more of a sense of give and take.
You know the story of the three visually impaired people who all have their hands on an elephant. And one of them is holding on to a leg, and one of them is holding on to the trunk, and one of them is holding on to the tail. And what they're doing with great passion and energy, describing what they have in their hands. And they're saying, no, this is what's real. This is what's right. And that's actually true, right? It is actually what they have. The problem is they don't see the whole. If they could learn to say, oh, you see something different than I do, and you see something different than I do, I wonder what that is, and if we could hear all of that, how we might see something more whole and complete than any one of us sees. That's where the body imagery comes in, is that each part has a part to play. Each one of you has a part to play. But the work, it's really easy to say God's emerging future. Yeah, we got to figure that out. We got to say where we want to be in 5 years, blah, blah. But the how you get there. Now, here, I want to name this for you. I think that there are two things that you need to pay attention to in the life of your congregation based on what I know. One of the things you need to pay attention to is you don't like having ongoing conflict that is healthy conflict designed to get to the whole elephant, so to speak. You don't like that. And so we're going to talk later in the morning about what you do to diminish that. I want you to turn to your table, and maybe in pairs rather than the whole table, because if you do the whole table, everybody won't get to participate. But when you find yourself with somebody that you really care about, and they have a really different opinion about what the right thing to do is, what is your automatic response? Do you fight? Do you freeze? Do you run? 60 seconds with a partner. Go. All right. I know you hadn't, that wasn't very much time. I just wanted you to go internal with that for just a minute. Come back here if you would. Come back here if you would. Come back here if you would. So here's the deal. If you don't hear anything else I say this morning, I want you to hear this. If you don't hear anything else, I want you to hear this. If you're going to have a life-giving future, you've got to get to deep commitment around the sense of God's emerging future. The way you are wired normally and the way your congregation does this work, what you get to over and over is some low level of compliance. It's sort of like this. Okay, Pastor, if that's what you want to do, you go ahead. Okay, consistory, if that's what you want to do, you go ahead. And what happens is we fail to get broad and deep commitment to the emerging future.
One of the ways we know when we have deep commitment is when things get hard. What happens? Do we then devolve into unhealthy conflict? Or do people leave? Or do people stay and fight? But when we see what happens, when we think we have some kind of commitment to a vision, and we start to pursue that vision, and then it starts to fall apart, the wheels start coming off the bus, then we have an idea that we didn't have the kind of deep shared commitment to a compelling vision. And when Jim said a minute ago that this is a collective effort, this is a shared effort, I want you to just do something with me. I want you to think about the person or the constituency at Christ Memorial that is just hardest for you to get along with. Because what they want is just not what you want. The direction they want to go is just not the direction you want to go. You know who that
They're smiling all over the room.
is? You know, the ones that are not like you. The ones that if it was up to you, they wouldn't be at the table.
They could come to church. They just wouldn't be at the decision-making table.
Exactly. Yeah, you want them here, but you don't necessarily want their voice in the room when vision is being discerned. And just to remind you that in this process where we have a body that has ears and eyes and feet and hands, that everybody belongs at the table to help us discern the vision. Everybody has a perspective that no one else here has. We can't have a collective perspective. we have different people in different parts of the system who see different things, and different people who interact with the outside system in different ways. And so we need everybody at the table. I've heard it said that discerning vision is a team sport. And when it's a congregational team, we need everybody on the team. And for some of you, that means you need to step up and say what you see. And for some of you, that means you need to step back and make space, welcome some other people into the conversation so that they can contribute what God has put on their heart.
What we're not saying is that Terry and the lead elders have got to get everybody who wants to come to a congregational meeting and in a group of 300 do this collective discernment. What we are saying is that there is this unfolding process where whoever the leader is, pastor, staff, lead elders, consistory, there's got to be this ongoing dialogue that puts stuff out. So a small group does some discernment, and then they come say, here's what we think we're hearing. And we get feedback. I did when we wrote Leading Congregational Change, I went to the University of Arkansas, and one of my friends was pastoring a church down in Coral Gables, Florida, a church of about 2,500 in worship attendance, and he saw the book at a Willow Creek conference, and he called me and he said, we had not seen each other in several years since college. He said, I saw your book, and I wonder, he said, we have just finished a strategic planning process in our congregation, and I wonder, before we're about to vote on it, I wonder if before we vote on it, if I could pay you to come spend a couple of days in our congregation and just see if you think we've missed anything. Our plan is a plan to relocate our historic First Baptist Church of Coral Gables from downtown out into a new community. It's a big change that we're working on. And so what I did was I went, spent 2 days. I started at 7 o'clock in the morning, went till 8 o'clock at night, and every hour and a half, over 48 hours, I did a small focus group where I just listened to 8 or 10 people. Here's what they're saying the plan is. What are you thinking about it? What are you feeling about it? What are you wondering about it? And I began, we did here with you guys, with Current Reality, I just began to look for common themes. And when that 2 days was over, what I did was I said, you've got some resistance out there. The resistance is not so much about whether this is a good idea or not. The resistance is that they've not had adequate time to process whether this is a good idea or not. And to this pastor's credit, he listened to that, and what they did was they postponed the vote by 6 months. That's a long time in a big church where there's a lot of tension going on. And instead, what they did was they created a series of focus groups where a set of questions that I heard as I was doing the initial focus groups, they created some focus groups where they answered some of those. They got some feedback where they came back and made some changes to the plan based on the feedback. Then they produced a FAQ document that they put out there. They did about 6 things like that. And when they got to the vote, they got about a 98% vote. One of the things that we know is that people don't have to always have what they want, but they almost always have to feel like they've been listened to. And so when you think about, we're not talking about a pastor going up on the mountain like Moses and coming down and announcing something, or a consistory or a lead team doing that. We're talking about a dialogue where you actually engage a broad range of people who see things differently. How many of you woke up this morning and said, I hope I get to go to a meeting today where I'm going to have to really be vulnerable and authentic in dialogue with somebody who sees the world really differently than I do? Right? So there's one person in the room. Nobody else raised their hand, right? And so the point that I'm trying to make is, to do this skill set well, you're going to have to face yourself. What's going to have to change in you in order for what we've been describing to take place? What's going to have to change in your leadership structures, how leaders go about doing leadership? When you get invited into conversations, Tricia uses a phrase a lot that I like, where she says, what we've got to do is we've got to face ourselves in a way that we talk so that others can listen, and we listen so that others can talk. And we're creating this dialogue where we come to this shared narrative where we all have a piece of the elephant, but what we want is the whole elephant. And so there's a narrative around current reality, there's a narrative around God's emerging future. There's something that gets in the way of your being able to do the work of the Spirit. And it is, I don't know quite how to name this. You all come to God's emerging future with some sense of ought, O-U-G-H-T, some sense of ought. In academic circles, they call it them mental models. I want to do a biblical illustration of a mental model so that we can get that into this conversation. In Acts 1:8, we all, if we've memorized any scripture, we probably know you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. But when I ask people, do you know what Acts 1:6 says? They say, no. Acts 1:6 is where the disciples came to Jesus and they said, now are you going to do what we've expected you to do? Now, this is a translation, right? But it's an accurate translation.
What it actually says is, now are you going to restore the kingdom
That's
to
what it
Israel?
actually says. But what they're saying is, all of our lives, we've lived in a community where we expected the Messiah to come, and we believe you are the Messiah. And what the Messiah is supposed to do is establish an earthly kingdom with a treasury and an army, kick the Romans out, restore Israel to the place of prominence politically, and there's a new trajectory, right? They had been with Jesus 3 years. He had taught. He had performed miracles. He had been crucified. He had been resurrected. He had walked with them for 40 days. And in Acts 1:6, they still don't get it. And it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're slow learners. It's because the power of a mental model. When we have something that's all of our lives, like they had been taught this in church. They had dinner tables where they had rehearsed that story around the table. On their calendars, I mean, everything about their culture had said, this is what ought to be. You know what the ought is more than anything else in churches in Western culture? It's the church growth mental model. The church growth mental model. Successful churches are churches that are growing numerically. We have more people attending worship this year than we did last year. We have more money coming into the coffers this year than we did last year. We have more people in small groups than we did last year. And do you know that in our lifetime, there's probably not anybody in the room who, so I'm 67, and I was in seminary when that mental model began to first be articulated by some guys out of Fuller Seminary. And up until that time, you had churches all over the country that were stable churches that were impacting their communities and reaching people, but they weren't growing. In the early 60s, that mental model began to emerge, and today you can't find a congregation, and we've had a conversation with maybe 50 people in your congregation who have said, if we do the work you guys are asking us to do, are we going to start growing again? It's the most deeply held thing that you have.
One of the things my husband says he hates about going to gatherings of pastors is that you see somebody, you know, that you like, that maybe you don't get to see very often, and you say, hey, how's it going at your church? And what's the first thing you hear? Attendance is up or attendance is down.
What you running?
And what you running. And Craig is just like, that's like the sixth thing on my list that I want to hear about. There are 5 more things ahead of that I think really are what my heart wants to hear from your heart. But that mental model of church growth being the measure of success is so powerful.
And almost universally today, even at Fuller Seminary, what they're saying is that mental model where it's been most successful has produced churches that have been, 5 miles wide but a half an inch deep. And all of a sudden, the culture has changed, and we're not producing the kinds of disciples who can engage a world that really doesn't share our values and that really doesn't see the world the way that we do. And so what we do is we huddle behind closed doors or inside the walls of the church. And so I want to surface that for you, because as you start working on God's emerging future, if the first question you're asking is, what do we do to restore Christ Memorial to being one of the largest churches in our denomination? or even one of just the largest churches in the city. Or maybe we would be satisfied to just be a growing church again. If that is the predominant question that you're asking, then I'm not doing my job if I don't tell you you're setting yourself up for failure.
Have you noticed how Jim is using the language, the emerging future, but up there it says God's preferred future?
No, it says emerging. I went
Oh, it
back and
says
changed
emerging.
it.
Oh, okay. Well, on here it says preferred.
Yeah,
Good
yeah,
for
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Okay. We used to use the language of preferred, and we used to use our understanding, just theologically, of how this works. We used to use the story of the Exodus. That creative tension is that thing that can get us, from here to there in a linear way. The children of Israel were in Egypt, and they needed to get to the promised land, and even though it was a big, messy process, they knew where we are, they knew exactly where the plot of land was that they were trying to get to, and the whole story of the Exodus is how do we get from here to that place that we know. And we stopped using that story because we no longer think that that story is the story of the church in the U.S. But now the story of that kind of deep change fueled by creative tension is the Acts story. The Acts story is really different. Nobody seems to know what's going on. Right? We have different things happening in different places, and over time, we start to see some things come together. We know that there are a ton of things that don't make it into the book because we know that the church was growing in so many different places during that time. The gospel was spreading, but it wasn't spreading in a linear way. It was spreading in a very messy way that people in any given part of the story couldn't see what God was up to. The people in Jerusalem had a hard time seeing what Paul was doing out there with the Gentiles, right? And then people were coming to know Christ in places that didn't even have any kind of connection to Jerusalem. They didn't care what was happening there. And we have almost a collection of random stories. It must have felt very random to them at the time. I don't know how much strategic thinking they were doing, other than God is doing an incredible new thing. Let's keep following him, and let's follow as far as it takes us. And so we have replaced, in our theological understanding, the idea of calling us to an Exodus story that happens in a messy but straight line versus the Acts story where we may not even know for 100 years what all was happening in 2020 in Holland, Michigan at Christ Memorial.
What we are saying is that collectively you can come, and you do this not with certainty, but with faith, to say, we believe over the next 5 to 7 years, this is the emerging future that God is calling us to. And then you begin, by faith, following that path. And what you're going to discover. Let me tell you about the story that about the church that I helped plant back in about 1998. We moved into the inner city of Houston, into a community that was the center of the gay community. It was the center. There were 8 halfway houses within a 1-mile radius of where we lived. There was a mixture of affluence and poverty. Just about 700 yards down the street that I lived on, there was a low-income apartment complex that was the center of the drug activity in that community. And what we did was, using this model, we began to say the traditional model of planting a church is not going to work in this community. And so what we did was we planted a network of house churches. And as we planted those house churches and we began to explore the land that we were in, we began to discover this like multiple parts and pieces of alcoholism and drug addiction, everything from halfway houses to dealers and everything in between. So we planted this network of house churches where we ended up doing about 10 or 12 years of work where we actually lived in community with young men and women who were in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. So Betty and I had 17 young men and women who lived in our home over a 14-year period of time. And there's
And
a
other
lot.
people were doing the same thing.
And there were like 6 house churches where every one of the house churches had some folks living with them, a pastor couple doing that work. And we have lots of great stories, and that's not the point of the story. Here's the point of the story. In those 10 years, what happened was that community got gentrified. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, there were no halfway houses in my community. And all of a sudden, all of the drug activity had been moved 2 neighborhoods over.
At least all the visible
All the
drug
visible
activity.
drug activity, right. All the poverty had been moved out of that neighborhood. And all of a sudden, we were back at a place saying, so the emerging future that we stepped into for 10 years, and we think, I could tell you lots of stories of ways that God used the work of that church to bless the lives of people and bring the gospel to them. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves in a place where we had to say, the context has changed. The emerging future for the next chapter of the life of this church is going to be different. Does that make sense? And so if you're not careful, your oughts will get in your way. I want to tell you what, pretty universally, we're both students of like missiology. We're working with several seminaries. We try to stay attuned to what's happening in the church across North America. And almost universally, the 2 oughts that are most present in conversations today are the ought of, rather than church growth, church health. So the mental model of a healthy body, like everything that we know about a healthy body and getting a healthy body, healthy congregation, same kinds of things are there. I'm not going to do anything with that, but I just want to say that congregational health becomes a much more important conversation than congregational growth. Some people will say healthy congregations often grow, but growing congregations are not necessarily healthy. That's the first ought that's out there. The other ought that's out there is the question, does the presence of this congregation add health and vitality to the community that we live in? So is our city a better place because we're here? When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, almost overnight, 250,000 people from New Orleans were moved into Houston. And for a decade or more, Tricia and I and other people in the city of Houston had been working to mobilize networks of pastors in super neighborhoods across the city. And when Katrina happened and those 250,000 people came, almost overnight, those networks of pastors that we've been fostering for a decade in those communities lit up. And both the mayor and the governor said that the success of integrating, serving, mobilizing the resources that were needed to get that 250,000 people who showed up in our city overnight, it was the presence of the church in the community mobilized together that had made such a profound difference in the success or failure of that experience. Increasingly, the question is, what does your congregation contribute to the health of the community?
And I want to put that in a context where we're not just saying, that you need to be good citizens or
Right.
good neighbors in kind of a civic sense. Be part of the solution, make the community a better place. What we're saying is that from the very beginning, going back at least as far as Abraham, what God has been about is I'm going to bless my people so that they can bless the world I love. That has always been the plan. God has not changed the plan. That's the plan. I'm going to bless a people who follow me, who serve me, so that they can bless the world that I'm passionately pursuing. And so that's the context we want you to hear that in.
So here's the third ought that I find out there, and it's the final one. And it's the question is, when people come to your church, when people come to your system, when they come into your system, in the system that you create, are you, as a matter of course, producing people who can love God, love their neighbor, stranger and enemy, as they love themselves? In other words, does it produce personal transformation? What happens in churches across the country is churches make good people, make moral people, they make people who abide by the law, but they don't make people who can love their enemy. They don't make people who can individually and collectively, when they see their government, mistreating poor, marginalized, or oppressed people, collectively stand up and say, this will not stand. When you look at the hard things that Jesus did and that he calls us to do, we're not regularly producing the kinds of people who can do those kinds of things. And the more broken our culture becomes, the more people are looking to say, is the church going to do that work? And so those three oughts in the God's emerging future are a critical component. Now let me just do one more piece, and that's the default future. The default future is what's going to happen if you don't do the work we're asking you to do. What people want to believe is, well, let's just work harder at just keeping things the way they are, and 10 years from now, we'll just still be a church of about 1,800 people. You know, we'll be 10 years older. Let's just keep doing what we've been doing, and things will stay stable. And, you know, that's another place where, like I did last night, I want to come up, you know, take you by the hand and look you in the eye and really gently and lovingly say, that is a lie. The default future goes down because the pace of change that's happening both in the church and in the culture, there is going to be this long, slow decline. We use the language often of churches are faced today with two choices and only two choices. They're either going to do deep change over time, or they're going to do slow death. And we know congregations that are saying, okay, slow death, that's what it's going to be. We're not going to do the kind of change that's needed. But those are the options. Now, deep change doesn't mean flip a light switch and tomorrow everything's magically different. Deep change is a long, slow process, like slow death is a long, slow process. But they're two very different trajectories.
But often, I think they're not saying consciously, we're going to choose slow death. What they're saying is, if we don't change, things will stay the same.
Right.
That's not the way it works, ever.
Or they're saying, if we'll just work harder, the things we've done have worked for us. If we'll just work harder, we're going to be able to avoid the default future.
Yeah.
And what I say to them is, okay, I'll see you in 5 years. Call me in 5 years when you've dissuaded yourself of that idea, or 10 years, because the default future, working harder at what you've been doing is going to produce the default future. Okay, let's do two things. Turn to your table. Like, the question we like to ask is, what are you present to? What that means is, what are you thinking? As you've been hearing this, what are you thinking? What are you wondering? What are you resisting? What are you angry about? What are you confused about? Like, just whatever is going on in you right now. We're going to give you about 10 minutes to just talk about that around the table. Just say whatever there is to say. What are you present to as you hear this? And then we're going to come back and ask you to reproduce the model.
Can you mute this?